is critical thinking on joints, and let's look at the 3 questions. So here this question asks you about movements, which means you must know movements which occur at the different joints. This one talks about some clinical applications such as subluxation and dislocation, which means you must know the definitions of these. And here is a question where you have some true statements and you have to pick the false one. Now let's look at this first one, which asks you, at which of the following joints would flexion and extension and abduction and adduction be possible? Now when you look at the possible choices, you are given elbow joint, interphalangeal joint, metacarpophalangeal joint, wrist joint, and then a combination. Now when you look at the elbow joint, at this one here, the elbow joint is a hinge joint. So the elbow joint is not capable of, there is only the movement of flexion and extension. So hence this one does not allow you to do abduction, adduction. Interphalangeal joints, these are the joints which are in your digits. So these are the proximal and distal interphalangeal joints. So if you look at a finger, you know the area where those creases are. So this is the distal interphalangeal joint and this is the proximal interphalangeal joint. And the only movement you can do at these joints, and this is the finger that I'm trying to draw, the only movements that you can do at these joints again are flexion and extension. So these two also are hinge joints. Let's look at the metacarpophalangeal joint. The metacarpophalangeal joint is the area where the metacarpal comes in contact with the proximal phalanx. So this is the point where the metacarpal comes in contact with the proximal phalanx. So here we have the metacarpal. So I'm just drawing the bone, and then here is the proximal phalanx. So at this point, so this is the metacarpophalangeal joint. So this is where your knuckles are. At this joint, you're capable of flexing and extending, and you're also capable of spreading your fingers or bringing them together. So that spreading and bringing them together is abduction and adduction, flexion and extension. So it's capable of both. So this is one joint which can do both these movements. Let's look at the wrist joint. The wrist joint too is capable of doing the same. So if you look at the wrist joint too. So let's look at the hand up here, and let's say that's the thumb and the fingers. So at this joint you can flex or extend at the wrist. You can also move the wrist medially, which is known as ulnar deviation or known as adduction. You can move it laterally, which is known as radial deviation or abduction. So even the wrist joint is capable of flexion, extension, abduction, adduction. So both these are. So the correct answer to this question would be 3 and 4. So this would be the right answer to this question. Now let's look at the next question. So here's the next question, and it asks you the difference between subluxation and dislocation of joints. And let's look at the choices. So the first choice is only synovial joints dislocate and fibrous joints subluxate. Now this is wrong, because any joint which is capable of movement can have dislocation, or there can be subluxation. So the statement is wrong. The second statement, which says dislocations are accompanied by fractures while subluxations are not, this again is not true, because dislocations are not necessarily accompanied by fractures, and subluxations may or may not have a fracture accompanying them. The bones which subluxate may or may not have a fracture. So again, this is not a true statement. Third one, dislocations cause complete bony disarticulation. That means the bones do not articulate at all in dislocations, while subluxations do not cause complete bony disarticulation. So this is a true statement, because in dislocation, so let's say for example in the shoulder joint, and if this is the scapula and this is the humerus, and you're looking at the humerus here, in dislocation, the humerus is not going to be articulating with the scapula at all. So what you will have is, if this is the scapula, the head of the humerus may lie anywhere. Let's say it's lying here. So there is no articulation between the head of the humerus and the glenoid cavity. So this is true. So there's complete bony disarticulation. So they don't articulate with each other. And subluxations are also known as partial dislocation. So there's not complete bony disarticulation. Instead, there's partial. So let's say, for example, the head of the humerus was articulating somewhere here. So there's partial disarticulation. So that is what is subluxation. So this statement is true. So therefore, this would be the answer to this question. So let's say that this would be the answer. But let's look at the fourth one, which says subluxations occur below joints while dislocations occur above. And when it says above, it means above joints. So this is a ridiculous statement. They occur at joints. So not below or above, they occur at joints. So that answer is not true. So therefore, the third answer is the true answer to this question. Let's look at this third question, which says all of the following statements are true except, and let's see what the right answer is. Primary cartilaginous joints are temporary. This is a true statement because primary cartilaginous joints are seen between the epiphysis. So if this is the epiphysis and this is the epiphyseal cartilage, this is the diaphysis or the shaft. This cartilage is present between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. They are temporary because sooner or later the epiphysis and the diaphysis fuse and no joint is present. Instead, you see a line which is known as the epiphyseal line. So this is true. Second statement, most midline joints are secondary cartilaginous joints. This is also true. And the reason it says most is actually because the symphysis menti, that means the area between the mandible, the center part of the mandible, that is called symphysis menti. Symphysis menti. That is not a secondary cartilaginous joint. It actually is a primary cartilaginous joint because the mandible really begins to ossify as two pieces and the two pieces fuse in the middle, and therefore you end up with one mandible. Whereas all of the other midline joints, for example, the intervertebral joint between the bodies of the vertebrae, the joints of the sternum and the joint in the hip bone, the pubic symphysis. So these are all secondary cartilaginous joints. So therefore, most midline joints, and all of these, as you can see, lie in the midline. So this is a true statement. This statement, the lateral meniscus of the knee joint is more prone to injury. This is false because it's the medial meniscus which is more prone to injury. The medial meniscus is very closely adherent to the surface of the tibia as well as the capsule of the knee joint. Hence, it's not able to move out of the way when there is twisting and the bones move against each other. The lateral meniscus is not firmly attached, so it moves with the bones. So it's the medial meniscus which is more prone to injury. So this is the false statement and hence the answer in this question. But let's look at the last statement too, where it says the tooth in the socket is an example of a fibrous joint. This is true. It is an example of a fibrous joint and a special example, and that is known as gomphosis. So therefore, this is the correct statement. This one here is the correct statement to this question.